At Thanksgiving dinner last year, my daughter-in-law stood up from the table, looked me straight in the eyes, and said, "You call this garbage food?" The room went silent. Not the soft kind of silence that settles between conversations. The sharp kind. The kind that cuts. I was standing at the head of the table, holding the carving knife over the turkey I had been roasting since 6 that morning. The skin was golden. The cranberries were set in crystal bowls. The mashed potatoes were still steaming. It was the first Thanksgiving since my husband passed away, and I had made everything myself. Vanessa didn't just speak loudly. She pushed her plate forward so hard it scraped against the china. A smear of gravy slid across the white tablecloth. "This is outdated," she added. "No one eats like this anymore." Someone shifted in their chair. My nephew cleared his throat. Daniel, my son, didn't look at me. He stared at his water glass. I felt something warm hit my cheek. For a second, I thought it was just heat from the oven. But it wasn't. Vanessa had leaned forward and, in a moment that still replays in slow motion in my mind, flicked a bit of food from her fork toward me in disgust. It wasn't about the mess. It was about the message. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the ticking clock above the doorway, the soft crackle of the fireplace in the living room. 23 people sat at that table. No one spoke. I placed the carving knife down carefully. Not loudly, not dramatically, just carefully. Then I took a napkin and wiped my cheek. And I said, evenly, "Dinner is served." I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my cooking. I did not remind anyone that this same turkey recipe had been requested every year for 3 decades. I simply resumed carving. Because dignity doesn't rush to defend itself. It stands. The candlelight flickered across the silverware. The smell of sage and butter hung in the air. Outside, November wind brushed against the windows of the house my husband and I bought 41 years ago. This house, the one Daniel and Vanessa had been living in for the past 18 months while saving for something bigger. The one still legally under my name. I carried the platter around the table as if nothing had happened. When I reached Vanessa, she avoided my eyes. "White meat?" I asked calmly. She hesitated. "Sure," she muttered. I placed 2 slices on her plate. Not too thick. Not too thin. Exactly the way I always had. Daniel finally looked up at me. "Mom," he said quietly. "It's just, things are changing." Changing. That word again. I nodded slightly. "Yes," I replied. "They are." And in that moment, I understood something clearly. This was not about turkey. It was not about seasoning. It was not about modern tastes. It was about position. For months, I had noticed small shifts. Vanessa suggesting catered holidays. Vanessa redesigning the living room without asking. Vanessa referring to my recipes as retro. I had dismissed it as generational difference. But humiliation is rarely spontaneous. It builds. It rehearses. It waits for an audience. And Thanksgiving provided one. As I returned to my seat, I glanced at the empty chair beside me, the one Robert used to occupy. He would have stood up. Not angrily, but firmly. Instead, I sat alone. And I smiled gently at the table. "Let's say what we're grateful for," I said. A few people shifted uncomfortably. My niece spoke first. Then my brother-in-law. When it was Vanessa's turn, she paused. "I'm grateful for new traditions," she said, glancing at Daniel. I held her gaze for just a second longer than necessary. Then I nodded. "Traditions," I repeated softly. Dinner continued. Plates were passed. Conversation resumed in cautious fragments. But something fundamental had changed. Not in the room. In me. After dessert, pumpkin pie, still warm, I gathered dishes in silence. No one offered to help until Daniel stood awkwardly and said, "I'll get these." Vanessa remained seated. In the kitchen, as I rinsed cranberry sauce from porcelain, I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. 72 years old. Silver hair pinned neatly back. Apron tied straight. Still standing. And that was when I understood. This was not the end of a holiday. It was the end of an illusion. The illusion that love alone preserves respect. The illusion that silence prevents erosion. Upstairs, in the hallway closet, sat a folder labeled Property and Estate. I had not opened it in months. That night, after the last guest left and the house grew quiet again, I would. Because Thanksgiving was never just about gratitude. It was about understanding what and who you're truly thankful for. And I was about to make sure that lesson was remembered. When the last car pulled out of the driveway, the house became quiet in a way that felt almost staged. The dining table was cleared. The candles had burned low, wax pooling against silver holders. The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon still lingered in the air, but it no longer felt warm. It felt heavy. I stood alone in the kitchen, drying the last plate. The dishwasher hummed softly behind me. Daniel and Vanessa had gone upstairs early, saying they were exhausted. Exhausted? From what, I wondered. From eating? From laughing? Or from maintaining a performance? I folded the dish towel carefully and placed it back on its hook. For 41 years, I had ended Thanksgiving the same way. Kitchen spotless, leftovers packed, coffee brewed for whoever wanted to linger. Robert used to sit at the counter while I cleaned. "You always make it look easy," he'd say. It was never easy. It was intentional. I walked slowly into the dining room and ran my fingers across the polished wood of the table. This table had hosted promotions, graduations, engagement announcements. Daniel once stood on that chair to recite a school poem. Now he couldn't meet my eyes. Upstairs, I could hear faint movement, closet doors opening, muffled conversation. Not raised voices, just whispers. That told me something. They knew. Not that I would yell, not that I would punish, but that something had shifted. I climbed the stairs deliberately, each step steady. The hallway light cast a soft yellow glow across the framed family photos lining the wall. Daniel at 10, missing his front tooth. Daniel at 18, holding his acceptance letter. Daniel on his wedding day, smiling wide. Vanessa looked radiant in that photo. Confident. Centered. I paused outside the spare bedroom they had been using since moving in temporarily. The arrangement was supposed to last 6 months. It had been a year and a half. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked into my bedroom and opened the closet. On the top shelf sat the gray folder labeled in Robert's handwriting, property and estate. I carried it to the bed and sat down. Not angrily, not emotionally, methodically. Inside were the house deed, tax records, insurance documents, and the updated will Robert and I had signed 2 years before he passed. The house was solely in my name. Daniel had never refinanced, never purchased equity, never asked. He simply assumed. And assumptions grow comfortable when they're never challenged. I closed the folder slowly and placed it beside me. Tonight was not about confrontation. It was about clarity. Downstairs, the clock struck 11. Thanksgiving had ended. But something else had begun. Not a fight. Not a feud. A correction. Because when someone stands at your table and questions its worth, they are not criticizing the food. They are testing the foundation. And foundations, when properly understood, don't shake. They adjust. And I was about to adjust everything. The next morning, I woke up before anyone else. Thanksgiving leftovers were still stacked neatly in glass containers inside the refrigerator. The house smelled faintly of sage and coffee grounds. For years, the morning after Thanksgiving had always felt peaceful. A little tired. A little messy. But peaceful. This time, it felt precise. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen island, the gray folder resting beside my mug. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. I already knew what it contained. Around 8:30, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Vanessa came down first, wearing leggings and an oversized sweater, scrolling through her phone. She glanced at me briefly. "Morning," she said. "Good morning," I replied evenly. She hesitated near the refrigerator. "About last night." I didn't mean for it to turn into a whole thing. I took a slow sip of coffee. "It didn't," I said. She seemed relieved by that answer. Daniel came down next. He looked tired. Not angry. Just unsettled. "Mom," he said, leaning against the counter. "Vanessa just feels like maybe we need to update how we do things. You know, modernize." "Modernize?" I nodded slightly. "And what does modernization look like?" I asked. He shrugged. "Catering sometimes. Smaller gatherings. Less formality. Less formality. Less structure. Less tradition. Less of me." Vanessa spoke again, a little firmer this time. "It's just food. It shouldn't be such a big deal." She was right about one thing. It wasn't about food. But I didn't say that. Instead, I asked a different question. "How long are you planning to stay here?" Daniel blinked. "What do you mean?" I continued calmly. "Your apartment lease ended 18 months ago. The housing market has shifted since then." Vanessa straightened slightly. "We're still saving." "Of course," I said gently. "And I've been happy to help." Silence settled between us. Not hostile, but alert. I stood and walked to the hallway closet. I returned with the gray folder and placed it on the counter. "This house," I said, resting my hand lightly on it, is not just a building. It's an asset. It has structure. And structure requires clarity. Daniel's expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. Mom, we're not trying to take anything from you, he said quickly. I didn't say you were. But assumptions can slowly become expectations if left unspoken. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. We thought we were family. We are, I said. And family, I continued, respects the table they sit at. No one raised their voice. No one accused. But the air felt different now. Clearer. I won't tolerate being diminished in my own home, I said quietly. Not by jokes. Not by trends. Not by anyone. Daniel looked down. Vanessa said nothing. I closed the folder and carried it back upstairs. This wasn't an eviction. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. And boundaries, when stated calmly, don't sound dramatic. They sound final. Downstairs, I could hear them speaking softly to each other. Not laughing. Not dismissing. Just thinking. That was enough for now. Because the real shift doesn't happen at the dinner table. It happens the morning after. When everyone realizes the foundation is still exactly where it has always been. That afternoon, I didn't bring the folder back downstairs. I let it stay where it belonged, on the top shelf of my closet, beside the winter blankets and the photo albums Daniel never asked to see anymore. Instead, I drove to the bank. Not because I was angry, because I prefer paperwork to arguments. The branch manager, Mrs. Reynolds, had known Robert and me for over 20 years. She greeted me with the same steady handshake she always had. Happy Thanksgiving, Evelyn, she said warmly. It was memorable, I replied. We sat in her office, sunlight coming through the tall windows, and I reviewed my accounts carefully. Joint access permissions, automatic transfers, emergency contacts. Daniel's name was listed on 2 accounts for convenience. College tuition leftovers that had rolled into investment funds. He had never misused them. But convenience has a way of becoming entitlement if it remains undefined. I'd like to update access authority, I said calmly. Mrs. Reynolds nodded without surprise. Revoking secondary permissions? Yes. Effective immediately? Yes. She typed quietly. Click. Confirm. Processed. No drama. No raised voices. Just documentation. When I returned home, Daniel's car was gone. Vanessa's too. The house felt still. I walked through each room slowly. The living room where Vanessa had rearranged the furniture last spring without asking. The guest bedroom that had quietly become their space. The kitchen island where she once suggested replacing my wooden cutting boards because they looked dated. Small changes. Subtle shifts. None of them catastrophic. But erosion rarely begins with earthquakes. It begins with permission. That evening, Daniel called. Mom, he said carefully. Did you make changes to the accounts? Yes, I answered. A pause. You didn't warn me. I didn't need to. His voice tightened slightly. We rely on those transfers. For what? I asked gently. Another pause. For flexibility. Flexibility. An interesting word for dependence. You're both capable adults, I said evenly. If you need support, you may request it. But automatic access ends today. Vanessa's voice rose faintly in the background. I couldn't hear the words, only the tone. Daniel lowered his voice. She feels like you're punishing us. I'm clarifying, I replied. Silence stretched across the line. Is this about Thanksgiving? He asked. It's about structure, I said. And that was true. Because humiliation is one thing. But assumption, that is something else entirely. I won't be disrespected in my own home, I continued calmly. And I won't finance the erosion of my position. He exhaled slowly. I didn't realize you felt that strongly. That, I said quietly, is the issue. After we hung up, I stepped onto the back porch. The late November air was crisp. Leaves scattered across the yard Robert used to rake meticulously every fall. The house stood firm behind me. Brick. Foundation. History. Thanksgiving had revealed more than poor manners. It had revealed misunderstanding. And misunderstandings, when left unaddressed, grow. I had no intention of letting this one grow any further. Not loudly. Not emotionally. But decisively. Because when someone tests your place at the table, you don't flip it over. You remind them who built it. 2 days after I updated the accounts, Daniel came home earlier than usual. I was in the living room, folding a wool blanket over the arm of the sofa Vanessa had once suggested replacing with something more contemporary. He stood near the doorway for a moment before speaking. We got a notification from the bank, he said. I assumed you would, I replied calmly. He walked further into the room, but didn't sit down. Mom, you didn't have to cut everything off. I didn't cut everything off, I corrected gently. I removed automatic access. There is a difference. Vanessa appeared behind him, arms folded loosely but posture alert. This feels extreme, she said. Extreme, I repeated. She nodded. Over food. There it was again. The reduction. It was never about the turkey, I said quietly. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. We didn't mean to disrespect you. I looked at him steadily. But you did. Silence settled between us. Not loud. Not explosive. Just undeniable. Vanessa shifted her weight. You're acting like we tried to humiliate you. I held her gaze. You stood at my table, I said evenly. In my home, and called what I prepared garbage. In front of our family. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Daniel stepped in quickly. She was joking. It was heated. People say things. Yes, I agreed. They do. I stood up then, smoothing the blanket once more before placing it down carefully. But words reveal posture, I continued. And posture reveals position. They both watch me now, uncertain. I will not compete for authority in my own house, I said. And I will not subsidize disrespect. Vanessa's expression softened slightly, not remorseful, but calculating. So what happens now? She asked. Now, I replied. We define expectations. I walked to the dining room and rested my hand on the back of one of the chairs. You are welcome to live here, I said. But living here requires contribution. Financially, respectfully, structurally. Daniel frowned slightly. We thought we were contributing. You were contributing presence, I answered. Not stability. The words weren't cruel. They were accurate. Vanessa spoke more quietly this time. Are you asking us to pay rent? I'm asking you to participate, I said. Participation sounds different than punishment. Daniel exchanged a look with her. This is because of Thanksgiving, he said again. This is because of assumption, I replied. Another silence. This one heavier, but clearer. You want us to treat this like your house, Vanessa said slowly. It is my house, I answered. The statement didn't echo. It settled. Daniel nodded once, slowly. We'll figure something out, he said. Good, I replied. No shouting. No ultimatums. Just recalibration. They went upstairs shortly after that. Not slamming doors. Not arguing loudly. Just quiet footsteps. And for the first time since that Thanksgiving dinner, the house felt aligned. Not because anyone apologized dramatically. Not because anyone begged. But because boundaries had been spoken aloud. Humiliation had been public. Correction was private. And that difference mattered. Because I wasn't trying to embarrass them. I was reminding them. There is a table. There is a house. There is a foundation. And none of it is accidental. The house was quieter after that conversation. Not tense. Just aware. The following week, Daniel transferred a modest amount into my account labeled house contribution. He didn't announce it. He didn't make a speech about it. He just did it. Vanessa began cooking dinner twice a week. The first time she did, she asked, "Is 7 okay?" Not because she needed permission to use the stove, but because she understood something had shifted. I didn't interfere. I didn't supervise. I simply showed up at the table when she called us. The food was different from mine. Lighter, less traditional. Quinoa instead of stuffing. Grilled vegetables with lemon instead of butter. I ate it without commentary. Because this was never about flavors. It was about footing. One evening, as we cleared plates, Vanessa paused by the sink. I didn't realize how much work Thanksgiving actually was, she said quietly. It usually is, I replied. She dried her hands and looked at me directly for the first time in days. My family never did it like that, she added. We ordered in. It was loud. Casual. There's nothing wrong with casual, I said. She hesitated. I think I mistook structure for control. That was closer. Daniel, standing beside her, nodded slightly. I should have said something that night, he said. At the table. Yes, I agreed. He didn't defend himself. He didn't minimize it. He just accepted it. That mattered more than any apology. Over the next few days, small adjustments continued. They began looking at apartment listings again. Not urgently, but realistically. Daniel asked about property taxes one afternoon, questions he had never asked before. Not because he wanted ownership, but because he wanted understanding. On Sunday, Vanessa approached me while I was sorting through old photo albums. She held a small envelope in her hand. What's this? She asked. Inside was a photograph of Robert standing beside the first turkey we ever hosted in this house. It was smaller, slightly uneven. We couldn't afford much back then. He was proud of that meal, she said softly. He was proud of providing it. I corrected. She nodded slowly. I shouldn't have said what I said, she admitted. There was no performance in her voice this time. No audience. Just acknowledgement. I know, I replied. Silence followed. Not awkward. Not strained. Just honest. You didn't yell, she said after a moment. You didn't embarrass me back. I don't need to, I answered. Because humiliation multiplies when it's mirrored. Structure corrects when it's reinforced. She seemed to absorb that. That evening, we sat at the same dining table. No holiday. No guests. Just the three of us. The house felt steadier. Not because everything had been resolved, but because it had been defined. Thanksgiving had exposed something. The days after had reshaped it. And reshaping, when done calmly, lasts longer than reaction ever could. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to protect. And sometimes protection looks like silence at the right moment, followed by action at the right time. A week later, Daniel knocked on my bedroom door. He hadn't done that in years. Do you have a minute? He asked. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing insurance paperwork. I set the pen down. Of course. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Not dramatically, just deliberately. We toured an apartment today, he said. 2 bedrooms. About 15 minutes from here. I nodded. That's good, I replied. He hesitated, then added, we can afford it. That word mattered. Not because I wanted them gone, but because I wanted them standing. I'm glad, I said calmly. He looked around the room. The framed photographs, Robert's old bookshelf, the quilt folded at the edge of the bed. I think I got comfortable, he admitted. Comfortable isn't wrong, I said. Assumptive is. He gave a faint, almost embarrassed smile. I never meant to assume this house was just ours. But you did, I answered gently. He nodded. And when Vanessa said what she said at Thanksgiving, he continued slowly. I didn't stop it. I guess I thought if I ignored it, it would shrink. Disrespect doesn't shrink, I said. It settles. We sat in silence for a moment. Not strained. Just reflective. I don't want you to feel like we were trying to replace you, he said. I studied his face carefully. You can't replace a foundation, I replied. You can only build on it. That seemed to settle something inside him. Downstairs, I heard Vanessa moving in the kitchen. Not rearranging. Not redesigning. Just cooking. Later that evening, she knocked on my door as well. We signed the lease, she said. I didn't react dramatically. When do you move? I asked. End of next month. There was a pause. If that's okay, she added. It is, I said. She lingered for a moment in the doorway. I've been thinking about Thanksgiving, she said quietly. I keep replaying it. So have I answered. She looked down briefly. I thought if I pushed back hard enough, I'd establish myself, she admitted. I didn't realize I was pushing against the person who made space for us. That was closer to the truth than anything she had said before. Respect isn't established through force, I said calmly. It's maintained through awareness. She nodded. I understand that now. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the house changed again. Not because tension returned, but because clarity remained. They packed boxes carefully. Daniel asked questions about utilities and insurance, things he should have asked years ago. Vanessa thanked me when I showed her how to season cast iron properly. Small moments, but steady ones. On their last night before moving, we sat at the dining table once more. No turkey, no spectacle, just quiet conversation. And when they left the following week, they didn't leave in anger. They left upright, independent, aware. The house felt larger after they moved out, but it didn't feel empty. It felt restored. Thanksgiving had been the rupture. The weeks after had been the real story. Because humiliation may start the lesson, but structure finishes it. And sometimes the greatest correction isn't removing someone from your table. It's reminding them how to earn their own. The week after Daniel and Vanessa moved into their apartment, the house settled into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Not lonely, not quiet in a hollow way, just calm. Their old bedroom door stood open now. The air inside felt lighter without boxes stacked along the wall. I washed the windows myself, folded fresh linens, and turned it back into a guest room. Not out of spite, out of restoration. Daniel came by that Saturday afternoon with a small toolbox in his hand. I figured I'd fix the loose cabinet hinge before it gets worse, he said. He didn't have to, but he wanted to. I stood in the kitchen doorway while he worked. He moved differently now, less like someone passing through, more like someone visiting with purpose. How's the apartment? I asked. It's smaller, he admitted. But it's ours. Ours. Not assumed. Earned. Vanessa arrived a few minutes later carrying a grocery bag. I brought dessert, she said, holding up a small pumpkin pie from a local bakery. We all paused for a second at that. Not because it was awkward, because it was symbolic. We sat at the dining table again, just the three of us. The house didn't feel tense anymore. It felt defined. Vanessa sliced the pie carefully. I know this isn't your recipe, she said quietly. That's all right, I replied. Not everything has to be. She nodded. We're hosting Christmas this year, she added after a moment. At our place. I looked at her steadily. That's a good idea, I said. Daniel smiled faintly. We'll probably ask you how to cook the turkey. You may, I answered. There was no sarcasm in my voice. No edge. Just clarity. Later, as they prepared to leave, Vanessa lingered near the front door. I've been thinking about what you said, she began. Which part? About foundations. I waited. I didn't understand how much you carried, she admitted. Not just financially. Structurally. That word again. Structure. It takes time to see what you've always stood on, I said gently. She nodded. I won't forget again. I believed her. Not because of the words, but because of the movement. They had moved out. They had adjusted. They had recalibrated. When the door closed behind them, I walked back into the dining room and ran my hand along the edge of the table. The same table where humiliation had tried to take root. The same table that now felt steady. Thanksgiving hadn't broken this family. It had exposed where the weight truly rested. And once that weight was acknowledged, everything aligned differently. The house remained mine. The boundaries remained clear. But the relationships, those were no longer built on assumption. They were built on awareness. And awareness, when earned, lasts longer than pride ever could. December arrived quietly. The house was decorated the way it had always been. White lights along the banister, evergreen wreath on the front door, the old glass ornaments Robert and I collected over the years carefully hung on the tree. But this year, something felt different. Not emptier. Clearer. Daniel and Vanessa hosted Christmas dinner in their new apartment, just as they said they would. It wasn't large, 8 guests at most. But when I walked in, I could see the effort. The table was set properly, candles placed evenly, turkey in the center. And when Vanessa saw me at the door, she didn't greet me casually. She stepped forward. I'm glad you're here, she said. Not performative. Not loud. Just direct. I handed her a small dish I had prepared, my cranberry recipe, the same one she once called outdated. She took it carefully. Can you show me how you balance the sugar next time? She asked. Yes, I said. Dinner began without spectacle. No raised voices. No sarcastic commentary. At one point, Daniel stood and tapped his glass lightly. I want to say something, he said. The room quieted. I'm grateful, he continued, for learning what it actually means to build something. And for the person who built most of what we stand on. He looked at me when he said it. There were no dramatic apologies. No public confession. Just acknowledgement. Vanessa nodded slightly beside him. Later, while clearing plates, she spoke more softly. I didn't understand how much weight tradition carries, she said. I thought it was control. It's continuity, I replied. She absorbed that quietly. That night, when I returned home, the house didn't feel like a battleground that had been won. It felt like ground that had been stabilized. The dining table stood where it always had. The kitchen counters were clean. The hallway photographs still lined the walls. But the difference was invisible. No one questioned my place anymore. Not because I demanded it, because I defined it. Thanksgiving had been a rupture. Christmas was proof of recalibration. Not perfection, not transformation, just awareness. And awareness changes how people behave when they step into your space. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the table alone for a moment. The same table, the same room, a different atmosphere. Humiliation had tried to take center stage months ago, but structure had quietly taken it back. Respect had not been forced. It had been restored. And restoration, when done without shouting, lasts. Because sometimes the most powerful response to public disrespect isn't public retaliation. It's private restructuring. And once the foundation is understood, the house no longer trembles when someone tests it. January brought a different kind of quiet. Not the fragile quiet that follows conflict. The stable kind that follows resolution. Daniel began stopping by once a week. not because he needed something, but because he wanted to. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he brought nothing but conversation. Vanessa came less frequently at first, not out of avoidance, out of adjustment. They were learning how to build something on their own. One afternoon, Daniel asked if I would review a mortgage document with him. They were considering buying a small townhouse the following year. I want to understand what I'm signing this time, he said. That sentence carried weight. We sat at the dining table again, papers spread neatly between us. I explained property tax clauses, interest rate adjustments, escrow details. He listened carefully. No impatience. No assumption. Why didn't I ask you about this sooner? He asked quietly. Because you thought stability was automatic, I replied. He nodded. It isn't, he said. No, I agreed. It's maintained. A few days later, Vanessa invited me to lunch, just the two of us. Not at home, at a small cafe downtown. She chose the table by the window and folded her napkin carefully before speaking. I've been thinking about that Thanksgiving, she said. Not just what I said, but why I said it. I waited. I felt like I didn't have a place yet, she admitted. And I tried to carve one out by pushing. Pushing what? I asked gently. Your authority. That kind of honesty takes time. Authority isn't removed by force, I said calmly. It's shared when earned. She nodded slowly. I understand that now. There was no dramatic reconciliation. No tears. Just clarity. When we left the cafe, she hugged me briefly. Not tightly. Not performatively. Just enough. Back at home that evening, I walked through the house again. The winter light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The table stood steady. The kitchen remained unchanged. The foundation, literal and otherwise, intact. Thanksgiving had once felt like a fracture. Now it felt like a boundary line. Clear. Defined. Not hostile. Daniel and Vanessa were building. Something separate now. Not under my roof. Not under my automatic support. But still connected. And that connection felt healthier. Because respect, once restored, doesn't need constant enforcement. It sustains itself. I poured a cup of tea and sat at the table where it all began months ago. I remembered the humiliation. The silence. The carving knife resting against porcelain. And I realized something. If I had reacted loudly that night, if I had shouted back or demanded apologies in front of everyone, the story would have hardened into resentment. Instead, it became structure. Not because I ignored it, but because I addressed it without spectacle. And sometimes, that is the most powerful kind of response. Not retaliation. Not revenge. Just restoration. Quiet. Firm. Enduring. By early spring, the rhythm between us had settled into something steady. Not perfect, but intentional. Daniel and Vanessa invited me over one Saturday to see the changes they'd made to their apartment. New curtains. A bookshelf assembled carefully against the wall. A small dining table that seated four. It's not big, Daniel said, almost apologetically. It doesn't need to be, I replied. Size had never been the issue. Structure had. Vanessa brought out a roast from the oven that evening. The smell filled the small kitchen quickly. Garlic, rosemary, something slightly overdone at the edges. I followed your temperature suggestion, she said. Mostly. I smiled faintly. Mostly is how everyone learns. We sat down together. No one performed. No one tested boundaries. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa paused and looked at the table. It feels different when it's your own, she said quietly. Yes, I answered. It does, Daniel added. You think about effort differently. He wasn't talking about seasoning. He was talking about weight. Later that evening, while Daniel washed dishes, Vanessa sat across from me with 2 cups of tea. I used to think control meant power, she said. But control without understanding just feels unstable. And what does understanding feel like? I asked. Grounded, she replied. That word mattered. Because grounding was what Thanksgiving had forced into the open. Not just hurt. Not just embarrassment. But imbalance. When I returned home that night, I noticed something else. I no longer felt the need to check anything. Not the bank accounts. Not the hallway closet. Not the folder labeled property and estate. Everything had been defined. Boundaries, once spoken and reinforced, don't need daily reminders. A few weeks later, Daniel called me about an issue with their landlord. A minor repair dispute. I handled it, he said, but I wanted your opinion. He wasn't asking for rescue. He was asking for guidance. There's a difference. And that difference told me everything. One afternoon, while sorting through old mail, I found a Thanksgiving recipe card written in Robert's handwriting. slightly faded, butter stains near the edges. For a moment, I stood in the kitchen holding it. The memory of that night, the humiliation, the silence, the carving knife, still existed. But it no longer carried sharpness. It carried instruction. Thanksgiving had not been about food. It had been about alignment. And alignment had been restored. Not through shouting, not through exile, but through structure. Daniel and Vanessa were no longer under my roof. But they were still within my respect. And I was within theirs. Sometimes families fracture. Sometimes they harden. Ours adjusted. Because when someone challenges your place at the table, you don't flip the table over. You steady it. And you let time reveal who understands why it was built in the first place. The following Thanksgiving arrived quietly. No tension. No uncertainty. Just the soft hum of preparation. This year, I did not wake up at 6 in the morning to roast a turkey alone. Instead, I brewed coffee and watched the autumn light stretch across the dining room floor. The same table stood in the center of the room, polished, steady, unchanged. But everything around it felt different. Daniel and Vanessa were hosting this time. At their townhouse. They insisted. "You've carried enough," Daniel told me over the phone the week before. I didn't argue. When I arrived that afternoon, the door opened before I knocked. Vanessa greeted me first. "Happy Thanksgiving," she said. Not brightly, not performatively, just sincerely. Inside, the table was set with care. Candles centered evenly. Plates aligned properly. A turkey rested in the middle, slightly smaller than mine used to be, but golden nonetheless. I noticed something else. My cranberry dish sat beside it. Vanessa had asked for the recipe months ago. She didn't announce it. She didn't point it out. But it was there. Daniel walked over and took my coat. "You're not carving this year," he said gently. "You're sitting." I smiled faintly. That sounds reasonable. When everyone gathered, Daniel stood first. "I want to say something before we eat," he said. The room grew quiet. He glanced briefly at Vanessa, then back at me. "Last year," he began, "I didn't understand what Thanksgiving actually meant. I thought it was just a meal." He paused. "It isn't." His voice didn't shake. It didn't dramatize. "It's about recognizing who built the table you're sitting at." No one laughed. No one shifted uncomfortably. The acknowledgement simply settled into the room. Vanessa added softly, "And respecting it." There was no reference to the humiliation. No retelling of the moment. It didn't need to be spoken again, because it had already done its work. Dinner unfolded calmly. Conversations overlapped. Glasses clinked lightly. No one tested boundaries. When the turkey was carved, Daniel handed me the first slice. Not as a gesture of obligation, as a gesture of awareness. Later that evening, after dessert was cleared and guests began leaving, Vanessa walked me to the door. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" I asked. "For not tearing us down when you could have." I looked at her steadily. "I wasn't interested in tearing anyone down," I replied. "I was interested in keeping the foundation intact." She nodded. When I stepped outside into the cool November air, I felt something I hadn't felt the year before. Peace. Not because I had won. Not because anyone had lost. But because everything was in its proper place. The table still existed. The house still stood. The family still gathered. But the positions were understood now. Respect was no longer assumed. It was practiced. As I drove home, I thought about that moment last Thanksgiving. The carving knife resting on porcelain, the silence after her words, the choice I made not to react. If I had shouted, if I had humiliated her back, if I had demanded an apology in front of everyone, we would have fractured. Instead, we restructured. Thanksgiving was never about the turkey. It was never about the seasoning. It was about gratitude. And gratitude, I learned, isn't something you demand at the table. It's something you teach, quietly, by standing firm enough that no one mistakes your place again.